Oh my goodness. Welcome to the Gospel Jazz. May the peace of the Lord be upon you and your family. We are here with some conversational improv through life, leadership, and Jesus. And we're going to talk, at least for the next couple weeks, about poverty. Kind of do a Poverty 101, kind of what is the problem. And then I think kind of a Poverty 102, that'll be next episode. And then what is our response then? So, I know for myself, bright-eyed kid right out of Bible college, my first youth ministry. We had some kids that were coming to one of our children's programs, and in Algonac we had a food bank. It was a community food bank, and I remember taking a box of food over to this kid's house. They needed some food, they didn't have any transportation, and that was kind of one of the first times I ever really kind of came face to face with poverty. I mean, I grew up middle class, white, suburbia, went to college, all wasn't a good college student. Beside the point. But I remember dropping off this box of food, and I remember this young mother, and there were several kids in the household, and she looked at all the canned goods. She was very grateful, but then she says, we don't have a can opener. And I mean, I don't know how good my poker face was. But I'm like, how do you not? Yeah. Okay, and so, same thing, went to the store, bought a can opener, and then I came back, and it was about dinner time, and all the kids were sitting down at the dinner table, and they had opened up one of the boxes of Pop-Tarts, and every kid had a Pop-Tart on his plate, and, that's what they were having for dinner that night. And it just, I remember when Chris got home from work that night, I mean, I was just, she'd been working in the public schools for quite a few years. She was a little more hip to the lives of some of her underprivileged students, But for me, I mean, it's still 20 years later. I mean, it's one of those things I can't believe, right? That there are folks that aren't living like I live. In a similar, this was probably a year or two later, but one of the other kids that was kind of in our youth group, I have all the kids over, we play video games and stuff. And I remember this kid standing at the door of our pantry. And I could tell that kid had never seen so much food in one place. You know what I mean? And the same thing just kind of went, you guys don't have a pantry at home? And again, knowing his upbringing, lower socioeconomic status, and I'm sure we'll get into all those things. So, I don't know. For me, it was just, it wasn't until after I was out of college, really kind of engaging the real world. Yeah. And of course now, being in the ministry for 20 years and we've all got stories, that just some people that really do need help, some people that maybe are scamming, some people that they don't know any other way. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And so I think you're going to kind of share a little bit about that, right? You have a presentation that you've put together, that you've presented, I know, many times in many different community groups, and I think you were just at Elma College here a couple weeks ago. And so, just, explain, right? Somebody who's maybe ignorant like I was 20 years ago.
20 years ago?
I was going to be kind to myself.
It's a different kind of ignorance. Changes.
What is poverty, right? How do people find themselves there? What are some of those maybe social rules or things that just happen? Yeah. Right.
So we've got this. We call it Poverty 101. It's something that we do in the community for as part of Hope House, the shelter. It's actually a pretty long. When we go and we do it somewhere, usually it takes about 2 hours to do, and there's some interactive pieces to it, and we get people moving around and making decisions and stuff and all that. So it's a lot of fun to do. But one of the things that is important to think about when we're talking about poverty is how to properly understand it. So to understand that poverty is not simply about how much money is in your bank account, right? That poverty really is about lacking the tools needed to participate in community. Mm-hmm. Right? Lacking the things necessary to participate in the world that you find yourself living in. And that's a really important distinction when we think about poverty in the United States versus poverty in other parts of the world.
Sure.
Because people like to say, well, to suggest that there isn't an issue with poverty within the United States because the poorest person here is, wealthier than the,
Sure.
people in third world countries. Well, while there might be some kind of truth to that, what's the reality is that folks in third world undeveloped countries actually have an easier time, a more equitable time participating, having the tools to participate in community than we do here, right?
Well, and I don't want to get us too far afield. In most of those third world countries, 95% of their populations are at that level.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know the kind of what
Not
you're speaking
only there,
it's that kind of it's kind of thing where you go. Whereas I don't know what the statistics. Maybe you've got those statistics, but whatever that poverty level is here in the United States, you go. It's not 95%.
Right.
no. So this is a statistic.
Both groups of people are stuck.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the
Yep.
reality.
And it's not suggesting that one is. It's not a competition about which one is worse. It's let's have the right conversation about each, right? So in the United States, 40% of America is living below the household survival budget. So that's either they're not considered poor, they're above the federal poverty line, but they don't make enough to survive. They're that working poor, right, so to speak. The United Way in some states has done a study called ALICE, and it's a way of defining that. And ALICE is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. And it's a way of kind of quantifying and that nebulous idea of working poor. So it's people below a household survival budget, in poverty, or folks in sub-poverty conditions. So, but one of the ways to think about the difference between poverty in the United States and poverty elsewhere around the globe is in very concrete, very simple, pragmatic terms, right? In third world countries, you can pack 4 or 5 people on a moped and go zipping down the sidewalks, right?
Sure.
Here, you
At
can't
least.
take your baby from the hospital unless you have a $150 car seat, right?
If it's that cheap.
If it's that cheap, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In other countries, you can be pretty, have some ingenuity in how you create income for yourself, growing vegetables, making things. You go sell it at a market. Here, your products have to be licensed. You have to pay taxes. You have all of these structures and things that are built into the system for the good of the whole, right?
Keep us safe.
But they disenfranchise some, and so you don't have the ability to access community. Another example that's hits very close to home for us, there is a community out west of town here where we're at, where like this whole little village, their septic systems are failing and leaching E. coli and bacteria into the groundwater, into the river, which is then feeding groundwater for other areas, right? Yeah. So the health department has gone in there and is trying to get those homeowners to update their septic systems at their own cost. In other countries, you can go dig a new pit toilet if you have to.
Or you just poop or pee wherever.
Or you just...
That's kind of how they...
Yeah. But so as a way of illustrating, right, what are some of the differences in poverty here versus other places, so that we can have the right conversation.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So that we can't go into this and be dismissive of poverty in the United States because it's different than poverty in other places.
Because that's kind of largely where we are as an American culture. A Western culture becomes very quickly dismissive of poverty, all conversations related to poverty, any effort there is to address the needs of poverty. So we need to have the right conversation. That's one thing I really like about that Poverty 101 presentation that you do, is you say that from the beginning. This is about having the correct conversation, not just rehashing something that has become dismissive and we become kind of deaf to.
Yeah. So I went to school, talk about being in college and not really seeing it. Also grew up middle class, went to school in Illinois, and 20 minutes, 15 miles, something like that, from our campus was one of, if not the poorest zip code in the country.
Wow.
and we are talking dirt floor poor.
Yeah.
Everybody from Oprah to Barack Obama to David Letterman have done specials on Pembroke and the poverty that exists there, right?
Okay.
And they all come in for their spotlight moment. We're going to fix everything, and then they leave. And it was actually one of my wife's cousins who got more involved there and really helped build a connection between Olivet and Pembroke, and she moved there and lived there for a while with the folks there. So there is real dirt poor poverty that happens right in our own backyards. We don't realize it.
Yeah. One of the things that I had learned when I had my first full-time ministry up in student ministry up in Oscoda County. At that time, and I don't know if this is still true now, but at that time, Oscoda County was the poorest county in Lower Michigan at the time, the 6 years that I was there. And it was that kind of poor, the dirt poor, where there's dirt floors, no doors on a trailer. It's got a blanket over it.
Yep.
That was so shocking. I did not know that people... I had heard about places like that. I had never visited them, but I had always thought that, well, that's like the hill counties of Kentucky and Tennessee. But then I move into a community that has this wide gap of a lot of entrepreneurs live up there. So a lot of them do really well. A lot of people who come up there, that's not their full-time place. That's a second home for them because that's a
beautiful
big,
homes up there.
Incredible. So it was very eye-opening to realize that this is like right here, and had the opportunity then to minister to some of those kids and their families. But man, what a shock to the system.
Yeah.
And it's the same in Gratiot County. And my guess is, anybody probably listening to this, that it probably doesn't matter what state you're in, or what county you live in. Probably just a dirt road or two off of the main road.
Yep. Not far.
Would be shocking to you. And again, same thing. You get ministering to families, and say there's a young man here that, there were two single wide trailers that had been abandoned on this property. He was living in a little pop-up camper with no electricity, and his mom and dad were living in a bigger RV camper that probably hadn't been on the road in probably at least a decade, and they had a generator hooked up to it, and I just thought, that's the life, right? That's the life that they're living right here in Gratiot County, and the same thing. And again, I'm we get too far ahead of ourselves, but then it is. You go, how does this young man then even begin, right, to get ahead, and to watch him try so hard, right? To work hard and to try to have a good attitude, and riding his bike miles and miles. Not even a car, right? Riding his bike miles and miles one way to work on a farm or to work, at a greenhouse or wherever. And so I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
And
that stuff is right under our noses, and we don't even unless we have eyes to see it, right?
Right. Yep.
We just look right past it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm trying to understand poverty is, and again, if we're defining it as the tools necessary to participate in community, what are those tools? And there are external and internal tools or assets, right? So some of the external ones are the ones that we think of. We think of money, right? Property, investments, family. Then there's other things like family members that have education that we benefit from kind of tangentially. Family members with financial resources, and people who just generally have support networks, right? Yeah. And then there's internal assets or tools like language. So if you really pay attention, there is a difference. People who live in poverty versus people in middle class speak different languages, right? We talk differently. There is sometimes it's in little subtle inflections and tones and wouldn't be akin to an accent. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's just the words that we use, and we end up not communicating, and that becomes one of the issues when we're working with people who are experiencing poverty. So language, education, sense of self, and that's a big piece is how people view themselves.
Yeah.
And what they have then internalized about poverty. oftentimes people living and experiencing poverty, they have internalized this view that there's something deficient within me.
Yep.
There's something wrong within me that is making me poor. And so when you have that sense of yourself, right, that leads to
Sure.
perpetuating the issue.
Yep.
So having a strong sense of self actually becomes a huge asset and tool in being able to participate in community. Hope that the future can get better,
Yeah.
and knowledge that my current actions impact the future. Right? People, something as simple as having hope that things can actually change, and a working understanding of how how things, what we do now, impact the future, and I'm going to use a hot button word here, the privilege of being able to exercise that knowledge.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Become huge assets and tools we don't think about. I mean, it isn't as though people who are experiencing poverty are stupid and don't realize the things I do today affect me tomorrow. They don't have the privilege of getting to defer certain
Even
things
think of- yeah.
or make sacrifices now for later gain.
Yeah.
And this,
Well, this is sorry, real quick. You know, this before we hit record, we talked about it, just right that whole mental health realm,
Yeah.
right? And so whether that is, I mean, again, I'm not a mental health expert. I'm sure some form of like a PTSD. You know, I mean,
oh yeah,
again, I've had these students come up through through our youth ministries who, when they think nobody's looking, they're pocketing all the snacks
Yeah.
at youth group or something because right at 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, right, they almost starved to death.
Yeah.
And here they are 15, 16,
Well,
18.
and that kind of
and
food
you can't-
insecurity is, man.
and you can't
powerful.
turn that off.
Right.
no,
And I've talked to some of their parents, some foster care situation stuff, and go, right, I bring the kids down and have them look at the pantry. We got plenty of food, right? They're stealing food in our own house. You know what I mean, kind of thing. Like, guys, the food's not going anywhere,
Yeah.
but you just can't switch it.
Yeah.
well,
off,
think of
you know.
like, our grandparents, right, who lived through the Great Depression,
Yeah.
or right after the Great Depression,
Yeah.
and think about how they
Decades later,
right,
still
decades
saving
later, they're saving every
little
little
scrap
thing
of-
and scrap because
My wife's great grandfather, I think it was great grandfather, maybe it was grandfather, who lived through the Depression, looked at my wife's father's house that had a big backyard. He said, "You ought to put it all in potatoes." Because he lived through the Depression. It was like, hey, we didn't have potatoes. There was a time when we didn't have the things that we needed, and if I had this yard, I'd put it all in potatoes. And he was dead serious.
But I'm sure if people just went and buy the big plasma TV and have the smartphone
Yeah.
and the satellite dish, I mean,
so
they could get so much further ahead, Jake.
well, and that's an important thing to think about. No,
We picked up with the sarcasm. Cranked it to about a 7.
so how often do
Fairness, right? I've had those thoughts before, right?
Sure.
Of people
Yeah.
you've helped out and go,
Come on.
right?
and
And then what's on our calendar? A trip to Disney World or a trip
hey, my
to
mom paid for that.
Well,
okay?
no, I'm not talking about right. I
Well,
mean,
you
or,
mentioned the language thing, and I think about talking about, you go, hey, we're going on vacation. What's vacation?
Yeah.
Right.
Right? I mean, what do you mean? I mean,
their entire year of a whole year's worth of fun, money, entertainment, whatever. They're not going to the movies, right?
Yeah,
Or rarely out to eat, or to go and do, take their kids down to
It's a
go
lot
to
of
the
saying
zoo.
no to everything that all the other kids are doing. We can't. It's a
And
no.
if you're a family who's living in a impoverished community, and this is a little bit of stereotyping, but it is also reality. So painting the picture that people live in, right? If you're somebody experiencing poverty, who lives in a poor neighborhood, right, where maybe there's high crime, maybe you're just under a lot of scrutiny because you're in a poor neighborhood, right? Where do you want your kids?
Yeah.
I want them in my house where I know what they're doing and keep an eye on them, right?
Sure.
So I want the best TV in the neighborhood,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
right? It's the same reason, and I've heard people like this. Well, we put a pool in the backyard because I wanted to be the house where all the kids came because so I knew where my kids were.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, your reasoning is the same.
Same. just
you
had
could
bigger
afford
budget.
a pool. They could afford a flat screen
Yeah.
and a
Yeah.
A Nintendo or something.
Nintendo
Yeah.
or something, right?
Yep.
So rather than imposing upon folks experiencing poverty our worldview, hearing from them, why are you doing the things that you're doing? Oftentimes, you can't argue with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, the way that we end up judging those who are doing things, we go, well, our judgment is completely arbitrary. Mm-hmm. Because we do not make the connection that, I have made a similar kind of choice, just some different circumstances, a different budget.
A different budget.
And I made it. But for some reason, we as middle and upper class feel justified in trying to impose our sense of what you should do on somebody else who doesn't live the same kind of life that we do. Mm-hmm. For some reason, we feel justified in determining what they're doing is right or wrong.
We'll look at somebody and say, well, because we're assuming, oftentimes we don't know this for sure, we're just assuming, because you're getting some kind of state assistance, therefore you're not worthy of any luxuries that I am because I work for my money. Right? Which is incredibly dehumanizing. So one of the important things to do is think about, how do we edify people? How do we speak life into them? How do we build them up? And I don't want to get into the
next episode.
Thinking through that, it does not come. You have to humanize people, which is why, and I'm trying to be real disciplined because I'm on record here, because it's a constant exercise. But I try never to say poor people or the needy. I hate that phrase, the needy, or people in poverty, or that's not a bad one. But instead to say people experiencing poverty, right? Affirm their humanity first, before you ascribe their ailment. Right? They're not homeless people.
They're not
They're
poor
experiencing
people.
experiencing homelessness. They're not poor people. They're people experiencing poverty. Right?
Yeah.
They're not drug addicts. They're people experiencing addiction, or the disease of addiction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Affirm the humanity before you ascribe the affliction. One other thing to distinguish is intersectionality, right? Which is things like, so thinking about things like dysfunction, race and ethnicity, addiction, and adverse childhood experiences, right? Oftentimes when we look at and we want to talk about people experiencing poverty, we want to suggest that these things, that dysfunction, race, ethnicity, addiction, and ACEs, they're poor because of those things, right? Or that those things define their poverty. And the reality is, they're completely separate issues, right? You don't have to be in poverty to be dysfunctional, right? All you got to do is read the tabloids about Hollywood. That's not the case, right? Poverty is an equal opportunity afflictor.
No.
It is not about race. Now, it can be said, and it's certainly true, that there are certain races or ethnicities that have higher rates of poverty, right? That's true. But those two things are not one because of the other, right?
Well,
They're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And this is to me, again, intersectionality, I think, is another one of those buzzwords. But, I think for whatever reason, we always want to make all these complex issues just about one thing.
Right.
Yes.
Right? That
True.
it's somehow mono whatever.
And if
you
that
go,
one thing was changed
oh
and
my
fixed, then
gosh,
the
we
whole
fixed the
problem
whole
would go
thing.
away.
And to me, I almost, that intersectionality, it's a multiplicity of things, which again, not to get too far ahead of ourselves in the next episode, it's going to have to probably be a multi-targeted response, right? We're not going to be able just to, let's get everybody good education. Right. Or let's just do, so,
And same thing with addiction and ACEs, right? There are people who are in poverty, middle class, and who are wealthy, who experience addiction and ACEs, especially the opioid stuff. I mean, it used to be that drug addiction disproportionately affected people in poverty, but that day is past, right? One question to ask when you're thinking about poverty is, how many people does this person know who have traveled outside of the state, have graduated high school, have held a living wage job, could loan them $100, or has owned a home. Wow. Right?
So I was just a couple years ago, I was asked to speak to that was the top 10 graduates or whatever at St. Louis, and not really quite thinking, right, about what would be your top 10. And I had the simple question. I said, how many of you guys have a passport? Every single one of them raised their hand. High school student,
Wow.
right? Because they probably went on the German trip or the Spanish trip or whatever it was. And the same thing, as you just outlined, right? You have people in poverty that you go, yeah, what'd you say, that know outside of the state? Let alone if you've ever actually traveled anywhere, or if you have, right? And
that speaks to those assets,
Yeah.
right? How
Assets.
the
Yep.
people
Yep.
within your network, right? How you benefit from or are affected by, positively or negatively, the experiences of people within your network.
Yep.
If I don't know anybody that traveled out of the state, I've probably never traveled out of the state, right? If I don't know anybody who could lend me $100, I can't lend somebody, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Thinking about that. And so if that's the world you live in, breaking out of that becomes a very difficult thing.
Yeah.
Just real quick, when my wife and I were both working, no kids, we would spend our weekends. We would head down to Hall Road, Lakeside Mall, and same thing. I remember talking to one of my students there. Great success story because he's a wonderful young man, but single parent home. His mom worked real hard at the local McDonald's. I'm like, you don't go to the mall? I've never been to the mall. And the same thing, we're talking half-hour drive, nothing crazy.
Yeah.
But the same thing, why would they go to the mall? You got money probably to put in the gas, let alone to get there to then even buy anything with all the jacked up prices at the mall, And but that was one of those moments too where you just go, you don't go to the mall. And obviously as I thought about that a little more, probably not.
The discussion about two different American experiences starts to come into greater focus when we start having the right conversation about poverty.
And that's an important thing, and again, we can't get sucked into all of these different issues, but when we have a conversation about poverty, about race, about politics, all of these things, right?
Yeah.
To be willing to create space to say, not every American has the same experience.
Yeah.
Right? And so we have to give room for people to share their story and to validate that and not say, well, because that wasn't in my experience, you're wrong.
And try and invalidate it, yes.
Yeah, which is typically how our conversations go.
Right? Which lends to the whole issue that we do not do civil discourse well. The reason we don't do it well is because, your experience is different than mine, so you're obviously a moron.
Right.
What? That's quite a jump from different experiences to complete idiocy.
Thank you, social media.
Yes.
But I mean, think.
Just kidding.
We're shut down. We got pulled off YouTube.
So thinking about the kinds of poverty, there are you could define 5 types of poverty. One is global, which we've kind of talked a little bit about. But then you have immigrant poverty, situational poverty, working class poverty, and generational poverty. So in thinking about these kinds of poverty, one of the things, again, hope for the future, right? Believe things can get better. How forward thinking do you have the ability to be? Right? So in global poverty, it's today. How do I get through today? In immigrant poverty, there really is that hope that things can get better. They're here because they believe it can get better. They're taking the risk because they believe it can get better. So they are convinced that there is a future, and they are able to endure the hardships of today to look ahead to the future. And to look to what could be. If you're in situational poverty, right, which is somebody who has experienced some kind of a setback, a divorce, a health issue, the loss of a job, something like that, the thought is, I can get back to where I was. Maybe I did it once before, I can do it again. And so there is that real push and hope again. And then the working class poverty, right, which is that Alice segment. Their foresight is payday. How do I get to the next paycheck? And that living paycheck to paycheck rhythm.
Working at the coal mine.
Exactly. How do I get from here to the next time I get a check? And then generational poverty, which is back to today. How do I get through today? And
it's interesting how the timeline gets constrained with every step every step down. The injury, how do I get back to where I was before, the paycheck to paycheck, and the day to day. The time frame just gets smaller and smaller, and it becomes a mode of survival.
Right. So, as you think about these kinds of poverty, there is psychology that really is at play in each of them, right? So, like in immigrant poverty, there's a really strong sense of self, greater than maybe in working class generational poverty, and there is this real belief that I can do what it takes to move ahead, and they tend to see poverty as a system problem, right? That there's a problem within the system.
Just real, I went to high school with several. Had some Hispanic friends. There was a lot of blueberry fields in Holland, so you'd have a lot of immigrant families maybe come up from Texas, and for part of the year. And I had some Hispanic friends. It was multiple families living in a house. And again, there's more of a cultural thing there, right? Where the same thing. My experience going, it'd be kind of weird having a couple other families, but I think about my dad's upbringing. He was kind of on the lower socioeconomic. They always had at least 2 or 3 other families living in their house, when he was growing up. But again, and I don't know this for 100% sure. I guess I could probably track down these people on Facebook. But my guess is that most of those kids who grew up in a home with multiple families probably have their own home by now. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But again, it didn't start there. And as you said, as you go further down that list, the further that will constrain the other way.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like in situational poverty, again, they're thinking, how do I get back to where I was? So they have some of those assets and tools that others don't have, right? They maybe have grown up in a stable environment. Maybe they weren't even a product of poverty, but middle class, and through some circumstances are experiencing that. So how does that come into play? A lot of times, if you can solve the crisis that got you there, you can get yourself back out of it. They have not internalized poverty as personal deficiency, right? They have not internalized the problem.
2008, 2009, right? How many people went bankrupt, right?
Yeah.
Or lost their house or lost their business. It just,
Right.
Well, it's just something that happened, right? Happened to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it's not. So...
I can remember clearly the 2008 the bailout for the automotive industry, right? My dad worked in automotive engineering, and I can remember the fear and the uncertainty that within our home, not sure what was going to happen. If GM and Chrysler folded, what was going to happen?
Because it wouldn't just be those plants. It would be the dozens or hundreds of other plants.
It would have been millions of people out of work in Detroit alone, right? It would have been, or in that area. And this, I remember standing there watching the news when that bill was signed, and my mom breathing a sigh of relief, going, "Okay, Dad was at work that day," but I can remember that was huge because there was such uncertainty about what was going to happen. And so you realize this really could happen to anybody.
Sure.
Right.
Yep. Not Mike Jackson, the guy for Elijah's Harbor. The same thing. Here's a multi-million-dollar guy, international companies, and the same thing. When all the banks come calling, same thing. He lost several of those businesses, and then I'm thankful that your family's benefited from that beautiful place there in Greenville, Tennessee. But again, right? You have to take this nice, huge home that you have and turn it into a nonprofit to keep from losing it. And so, one of those things affects from top down. But like you said, you don't internalize. It's not such a personal...
Right. And for that reason, sometimes those folks can be a harsh judge of poverty, right? They can look more harshly upon people who are experiencing other forms of poverty. So then working class, again, the foresight is payday. They're working, but they're barely able to make ends meet, to meet their needs, right? If they're even meeting their needs. And that's where they're really depending upon government entitlements to help close that gap. And one of the problems that you find if you really study this, and we have when I do this presentation, we have this whole case study we go through, and it works, and it's very interactive. And we begin to follow a family over the course of 18 months to 2 years, right? as income changes, how that affects other parts of their life. And what you see very clearly is that just adding income does not equate to a higher standard of living or solving the problem. There is this huge benefits cliff. When you hit about $15 an hour of full-time income for a household, for a family of 4, let's say, you begin to lose benefits. By $17 an hour, you qualify for 0 benefits. To live at that same standard of living that you had at maximized benefits, you need to make $21 an hour and full-time income. Right? Find a full-time job that pays $21 an hour. There's not a lot
to
of
make
them,
that
especially
Not in Gratiot County.
Yeah, and to make that jump from 15 to 21,
Right.
you're not getting that in one pay period, one raise, one promotion. That
Right.
has not
Yeah.
It
happened.
happens over years.
Yeah.
If you can manage
Yeah,
to get that,
with,
right?
with probably no higher education,
Right.
right? I mean, with, you know,
So you have 2 people in the household working full time, making a minimum wage. You're not there.
Yeah.
Making $12 an hour, you're hardly passing that, right? And that's just to, and that, again, that would not even be survival budget. That's still survival budget in Gratiot County. Our county is $28 an hour in full-time income, right? So you might be at the same standard of living with your benefits, but you're not paying for childcare.
yeah.
You're
Which
not,
you need if you have full
right.
I was going to say, yes.
Right, you're not paying
and-
for some of these things that you need. So that's
And then we go back to, like you said, the matrix of family, right? Like, do you have a grandpa and grandma? I mean, we benefit from that at least one day a week, right? Able to drop off my kids, have grandpa and grandma watch them. But again, that's privilege, blessing, whatever you want to call it, right? That's part of the deck that's stacked in my favor. Whereas, like you said, there's other folks may not have those options.
right. And so being able to name the fact that these are assets I have that others don't
Yeah.
does not give me the right to impose upon them what they're doing wrong and why they're poor.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Um,
Well, you watch their kids while they go to work. Well, but I mean, okay.
yeah. So they tend to be renters as opposed to homeowners, so they're not building equity.
Yep.
They're living paycheck to paycheck. They often don't have health care, and they don't have health care in their working jobs that tend to be very physically demanding, right, which compromises their health. And they begin to see poverty as personal deficiency. There's something wrong within me. And then generational poverty, these are folks who, they tend to be workers of the land as opposed to owners of it. They've never known anyone who benefited from education.
Oh.
Right? And think about that. How often we say, well, you just go
Yep.
go to school.
We're
I've
we're
never
part of that generation. Right?
Yes.
Gotta go get a college degree.
Yep.
Okay, I got one. Now what do I do?
And they've never known anybody who's
Start paying your
benefited
college
that.
debt.
Right.
No job.
That's what they've seen, right?
Yes.
They've seen people who've gone, they've tried, they either got a degree and didn't get a job, they're in debt, they're,
Yeah, 6 figures in debt. Yeah.
if they've even graduated high school. Right?
Yeah.
Young people oftentimes aren't graduating high school in generational poverty because they're getting a job to help the family.
Support.
Yeah.
They've never known anyone to move up or who was respected at a job. They tend to be highly mobile, moving frequently, looking for work, high illiteracy rates, and their focus is on how do I make it through the day?
Yeah.
How do we do this? And again, they have fully internalized that poverty is something wrong within them. There's something about me that's deficient, and that's why I'm poor. So how the world looks, like if you're, how does the world look to you? If you're in generational poverty, your outlook is life happens to me, and I have no control over it. If you're in working class poverty, I have some control over my life, but not very much. If you're in situational poverty, I pulled myself out of poverty. If I have to do it, if I can do it, anyone can. You have to work hard, make better choices, right? And immigrant poverty, I have the power to make a better life for me and my family, right? So understanding that how you approach the world based on your experiences defines a lot of what you're able to do, right? That's significant. And that's something we oftentimes don't create space for within our conversations. So some internalized beliefs of people who are in poverty. What is it that they have internalized and come to believe? That no one cares.
Mm-hmm.
That you and those you love are the problem. That you are dirty and not welcome. That your way is wrong. Because you must change and act middle class.
Oh.
Right? And so much of our approach to working and serving those experiencing poverty is how do we make them middle class? How do we make them like us? Right? Which is a bit of a problem in and of itself, because we make them like us so we feel better about ourselves,
Sure.
right? And we don't feel guilty.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Look what I did for them.
Exactly. Do whatever it takes to survive. Be tough. Give off an aura of violence to protect yourself. Kind of that strike first thing.
Man.
Which you see, and you can. I mean, I've experienced people like that working with folks in our shelter and things. The walls are up; they're kind of cold, and it is very much a strike first thing. Why? They've learned that they have to. It's a coping mechanism. They have to protect themselves.
Because I'm on my own. The world's pitted against
I know.
me.
Yeah.
Right.
What would you do if the world was pitted against you?
That's exactly how you'd be.
Yep.
Yeah.
People work hard and never move up. Illegal or impulsive activity can bring immediate relief and help with the crisis of need, right? So I'm stealing a loaf of bread because
Hungry.
I'm hungry.
Yeah.
I'm going to drive without insurance because I got to get to work to pay the rent.
Yep.
Things like that. And that's something I can say in our community, our criminal justice system is beginning to see the difference between criminal thinking, or what we call criminogenic thinking, right, and crisis or survival thinking, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just looking at people who break laws and saying, well, they're criminals, they're thinking the rules don't apply to me, they're beginning to understand, no, they're aware the rules apply to them.
This guy's got to keep his
They're
job
trying
to
to
keep
survive.
a roof
Right.
over
right?
his head for he and his kids. And
unlike
on the table.
criminogenic thinking, they've weighed the consequences and they're willing to take the risk to survive.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? Life happens to you. There's no sense trying because nothing will ever change. Education means stress and more pressure on the family. So why try?
Well, that's true.
Well, right. And again, if you've grown
That's
up
a true
in a
statement.
family like that, there's a real sense of duty and taking care of. Why would I bring that upon my family?
Yeah.
Sure.
So you don't even try.
Sure.
You may get something nice, but you don't get to keep it because things get taken away.
Oh man, yeah.
Right? I've known people, they get an apartment, they don't get like, it's not like they get, top end things. They get enough to furnish the apartment, and then next thing you know, they've lost the apartment and everything in it, and they're starting all over again somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right? No matter how hard I try, nothing changes. There is no hope. You are not a person without material items and money. And those making it
Cultural.
are better and smarter than you.
Yep.
Wow.
So I would finish this with kind of thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of need. Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you think of that, right, is physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization, right?
Yep.
People who are experiencing poverty, they spend their whole life right down here, right, this physiological needs. How do I sustain life?
It goes back to that strike first mentality, right? Because that's the mode
If
you're
your
in.
whole world is how do I survive, how do I ensure I have shelter, how do I ensure I have food, how do I ensure I have clothing, right? All of these things, if that's your world, how do you deal with the growth that comes with safety needs, right? Like employment, resources, and property, love and belonging, trying to create community, esteem, and self-actualization, which deals with those things, right?
Yep.
What the thing which tends to keep people in poverty is the fact that they've internalized personal deficiency, right? And they don't have hope, and they don't have the ability to confront those things or deal with those things because those are the top of the hierarchy of need. They spend all their time down here at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess as a springboard then into how do we respond, one of the questions for us as church leaders, as Christians, people working in social services, is how do we work with those experiencing poverty where their physiological needs are met, and we're able to help guide them to these other needs so that they can actually
Be whole.
Be whole.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, Jake, thank you for sharing,
Yeah.
and again, hope that's been beneficial to you as you've listened to Poverty 101, getting at least a little better grasp. It is a multifaceted issue, and hopefully you'll tune in for next week's discussion, too, as we take this big ball of yarn and try to unwind it at least a little bit with some practical ways.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in. God bless. Have a good day.